The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut and the mouth was smeared with a crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and high duty seemed to shine through it. The sight of it gave us courage, so that our voices seemed to ring through the little vault. And then the writhing and quivering of the body became less, and the teeth ceased to champ, and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still. The terrible task was over.
Fucking hate it when my teeth cease to champ. So that always fucking sucks when that happens.
Doctor, my teeth haven't been champing lately. What's up with that?
Yeah, somebody came at me with like the hammer of Thor. I don't even know how they know about Marvel movies in the
Well,
18. No, I'm kidding.
first,
I'm kidding.
first they clamp, then they champ, then they stand still, right?
I'm always saying that.
Socialist shelf. Read good books and organize yourself. Socialist shelf. Read good books and organize yourself.
You're now listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
Welcome back to the Socialist Shelf. As always, we're doing our holiday episode a little out of sync. You can consider this maybe a Halloween one here in the
Is this
lovely,
our
lovely month
Halloween
of
episode?
in the lovely month of January. I, as always, am Lenore here with Jacob,
Ayo.
and we have a guest today.
We do. The story of this guest is atypical. Typically, I'm reaching out to folks or whatever, different podcasts that we collab with, artists. But in this case, I was literally like, I want a guest for Dracula, talk about vampires, talk about Dracula. I'm just putting it out there into the ether. I'm gonna see who DMs me. And Scoob, you DM'd me within like a minute, I think, of me putting that post up. It was the right time, right place. I was like, hell yeah, we got our Dracula guest. So if you want to introduce yourself, we got Scoob on the pod today.
Hi, hello. Hi. I think the timestamp when I saw your skeet was 6 seconds. And I was like, oh, let's do this.
That's awesome. That's so sick.
First of all, I'm so glad we have somebody else on the pod who believes wholeheartedly in skeet. You know, I I
was,
see people calling him posts. I see people calling him tweets just out of habit. No, we got skeet. It's perfect. We're moving forward with it.
hell yes. I was one of the first 100,000. That's what we started with, and that's what we're doing.
That's what's up.
There we go. Blue sky royalty here. We are pretty much almost, no, we're not exclusively on Blue Sky. We do have our Instagram, but like I don't use Instagram. Um, Becoming more and more a fan of Blue Sky recently. But yeah, that's where we've met Scoob through. Scoob, you're a vampire fan. What's your background with Dracula? What makes you interested in this before we get into the life of Bram Stoker?
I was evangelical. I know you were as well.
Yeah.
So what I could watch, what I could listen to, heavily restricted.
Mm.
I think because neither of my parents finished high school, they did not care about reading at all. They were like, it's fancy book learning. I don't know. So I could read whatever I wanted. I read Stephen King's It at like 8.
Mhm. Oh wow.
Wow.
Super well, doing super well. We're powering through it. But Dracula was a book I picked up at Walmart for $1.
Very nice.
I would have been about 9 or so.
Call that Dollar Dracula. Dollar
9,
Dracula.
God. And see, like I'm 31 now, and like I opened this book and I enjoyed reading it, but like the print is very, very small. Very, very small. I can't imagine slogging through it at 9. So kudos for that.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, just a little horror nerd from the beginning.
Hmm. Yeah. Lenore, do you have any background with Dracula? I mean, I'm sure you know the character, but have you read this book before?
No, I hadn't read the book. I've consumed, all kinds of vampire media, stuff adjacent to it. Of course, Last Voyage of the Demeter was based on chapter 7. I was, I'm not ashamed to say that I was a Twilight head when I was in high school. To a degree, still am. Um, but yeah, no,
My husband is actively reading through the Twilight books right now.
let's
So, for the first
go.
time. So,
Let's go. And how's he liking it?
I think he likes it well enough. You'd have to talk to him, but he seems to be having enough fun. I mean, enough fun to be on, I think, the third book. So,
I will sit down and watch the movies any day. Those get better and better because they lean
uh,
into the silliness of it all.
we can have that discussion another time. I disagree, but go on.
Yes, yes, over a screening of Twilight, perhaps.
Perhaps. Well, my background with this, I'd not read this whole book. I'd actually, there was like some chapters we read in a class I was in, a gothic class I was in college. I wish we
What,
had
like
just read
goth
the
class? Like you learn how to be a goth?
You go to Hot Topic, yeah. No,
Heck yeah.
it was, a Gothic literature class. I wish we had read that. We should have read the whole thing. I don't know why we didn't. But we read a few chapters and I enjoyed it then. I just didn't, whatever. So over the last well, it was a couple weeks ago, I picked it up and read through this thing, and yeah, there's a lot to talk about. It's fascinating, it's interesting, and also, of course, it's part of this greater vampire mythos. But Bram Stoker himself, I'm interested in as a writer. So I've got a bit of a bio here, as always, and feel free to jump in if y'all have a comment or I don't know, correction, thought. Bram Stoker, born in 1847 in Dublin, Ireland, the third of 7 children, smack dab in the middle right there. Relatively privileged family. His father was a senior civil servant, jumping around between jobs, but always in kind of the upper levels of that sort of Irish senior civil servant job. Privileged family, and his eldest brother is actually Sir Thornley Stoker, who is actually an interesting.
Thornley?
Yes, Thornley. Interesting guy in his own right. He actually became a famed surgeon and got named a baron by the government just for like his service. Like he
I
was so
wonder I wonder if he ever met Oscar Wilde's father, because he was a
put
big in
put
Irish surgery as well.
put a pin in that. Um, the not for too long either. Bram grew up sickly, bedridden. It's unclear what disease he had, but he had something. He attributes this to his creativity, though. He says that laying in bed till basically age 7 or 8, not getting to play outside, he like had to dream up worlds in his head. He recovered and he actually like later was an athlete, rugby player, all the way up through Dublin University. He played college rugby. He's no like star, but it's a long way to come from a kid who couldn't get out of bed when he was 8 years old. He studied mathematics at Trinity College and got his master's degree in that. And at the same time, served as the head of both his college historical society and the college philosophical society at the same time. And at the head of this society, he was responsible for getting another of his colleagues a ranking position in the historical and philosophical societies of Ireland and the UK. One Oscar Wilde. They were college
Really?
friends. Yeah, they
Wow.
they were college buddies. And this is where he wrote his first published work, Sensationalism in Fiction and Society. Graduated, joined the civil service like his father. He soon became a freelance theater critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, which was actually a very looked down upon profession.
But not as looked down upon as the theater cricket, whose job it is to make sounds when nobody is clapping.
That's the most esteemed. That's the most esteemed position in the Irish theater. Uh,
Depends on where you are in the audience.
his boss, though, was Sheridan Le Fanu, the writer of Carmilla. Do either of y'all know Carmilla?
Yes.
The name is familiar to me. She pops up in like the Castlevania
Yeah.
games.
Scoob, have you read Carmilla or what's your background with that?
I read it in high school. I did look at broad strokes just to reestablish, but yeah, Uh, it's a real sexy book.
Yeah. Now we got lesbian vampires, folks, going on. It's like it's pretty overt, especially for the era, and it was very influential on Dracula for sure.
Hmm.
Stoker enjoys writing a lot at this time and getting to know Sheridan Le Fanu. He wrote stories like The Crystal Cup and Chain of Destiny, which were just kind of unknowns. He also met Henry Irving, one of the most famous actors in Europe and the United States and the Anglo world. And he was a famed actor and theater producer. In fact, he met Irving because he wrote such a glowing review of Irving playing Hamlet that Irving asked him out to dinner to hang out because he was like, "You wrote so nice about me, like I'm buying you a drink or whatever." Um,
Well, and nowadays, like he would just make like a podcast just like gassing him up.
yeah, basically so. Uh, he would then later work for Henry Irving at his theater when Irving would start his own theater and would name his only son after Henry Irving. Like he
Holy
was
shit.
into this guy. He was obsessed. In 1875, he published his first novel, The Primrose Path, and then like proceeds not to write novels for years. In 1878, Stoker marries Florence Balcom, the former partner and lover of Oscar Wilde. The two swore enmity over this.
No
Yes.
way.
But
How did I
then,
how did I miss this in the Wild episode?
yes, but Stoker would then become friends with him again after Wilde's public fall from grace, and he basically stood by Wilde
Oh,
through
okay,
that.
okay.
It wasn't to Stoker's maybe not full credit. For those who don't remember from the Wilde episode, Oscar Wilde was outed publicly as homosexual and also just according to Victorian society a deviant in a lot of ways. And got sentenced for that. Stoker was not super loud about standing with him, but he would like continue to visit Wilde, support him, and not speak ill of him. So they reignited that friendship. So they moved to London, and Stoker manages Irving's Lyceum Theatre for 27 years. At this time, he got along in the Literary Society and made friends with his distant cousin and rising star, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This dude this is like the multiverse of like fucking Victorian literature. I'm telling you.
This guy's everywhere. What the hell?
Um, no, it gets better. He travels the world with Irving, right? When Irving starts to tour, goes to the US where he meets both McKinley and Roosevelt, who were fans of Irving's work, and another man with whom he'd maintained a literary friendship, Walt Whitman.
Fucking like Forrest Bram Stoker Gump over here. Jesus,
Yes,
he meets everybody. He's at every pivotal like
yes.
individual.
And what's so funny about it is Bram Stoker is not that well known of a novelist in his day, right? He's not a super successful novelist. He's getting published, but he's like at these crossroads of all these people. Like he's met all these people, and he's like at least 1 degree removed, if not less, from everybody of the who's who. Um, he and there's more names that are like relevant at the time that he was also quite around. I want to read a passage from something he wrote to Walt Whitman that I found interesting before they sort of were writing letters back and forth. This was like his letter when he was just writing fan mail to him. Quote, make of this what you will, people have. How sweet a thing it is for a strong, healthy man as I, with a woman's eye and a child's wishes, to feel that he can speak to a man who he can be if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul. I don't think you will laugh, Walt Whitman, nor despise me, but at all events, I thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. He goes on then to say that if I see you in person, I will say what I now cannot write. Um, so, make of that what you will, but he also famously like never had sex with his wife, Stoker did. Um, there's several rumors about Stoker potentially being a homosexual. We don't know. Um, people make inferences from Dracula. I don't know if that's super fair, but there definitely is like some raciness in Dracula. That's like a thing that's debated endlessly, and I don't feel like qualified to like weigh in on it. I don't know if either of you have heard much about this or have any opinion on it.
In relation to Dracula,
Or just anything. I don't know. Like, have you heard much about the Bram Stoker, like the sort of the debate around this?
yeah, he was friends with the painter Whistler as well.
Yes, he was.
The guy who
And
paid his mother.
Yes, correct.
So,
But
Who didn't he know?
no, it's I mean, in Dracula, there's some, I think, fairly pointed stuff about sexuality beyond the obvious,
yeah,
which that's a hell of a way. That's a hell of a quote that you started the show with.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's for sure. There's sexuality in here, yes, and there's also like um really strict delineations of how and at whose behest one can be sexual, especially if you're a woman.
I
Oh,
read some of his like autobiography or not autobiographies, but his biographies. And one of his biographers makes the note in every one of his stories. He describes men in detail and describes women as blonde or fair. And
very
I'm like, and I don't know, that's not a great tell on someone's actual sexuality, but it is a funny note. But it's worth noting he has a living grandson now who has like, or maybe great grandson who has argued that his great grandfather was a homosexual. There's so like there is, I mean, this is a live thing. I think it's interesting to know the director of Nosferatu, F.W. Murnau, was gay, and he found the themes in Dracula to be like affirming of his like, or like he felt seen or whatever by Dracula in a way. So I find that interesting. But we're not here to make whatever, but much debate about it. He certainly was obsessed with Irving. Uh,
Dacre Calder Stoker, the great grandnephew.
Oh, nephew, great grandnephew, yeah. So all
He
kinds of interesting stuff there.
he coached
he
the men's
lives.
pentathlon team at the 1988 Summer Olympics. Wow.
It
Okay.
all connects. Anyway, to get I've not even to get I'm towards the end here because we're almost to Dracula, but he's writing all this time and people are publishing it because they're like, "Oh yeah, you're Henry Irving's friend." But like he's kind of coasting on that. And then in 1890, Stoker visits the town of Whitby on the coast, the very town where Dracula lands. You obviously recall in the books Lucy walking on the crest, the broken down abbey, some of the most, visually striking moments of the book, and of course, where the Demeter lands. And this is also a month after Oscar Wilde was imprisoned. He was feeling a lot of feelings. He was inspired there near the Whitby Abbey ruins. And he did publish another book that year, a gothic thriller set in Ireland, but he set to work writing Dracula and put together over 100 pages of folklore notes. And until less than 2 weeks before it was published, the title of the novel was The Undead, which is a term that Stoker is the first person to use in the terminology we have today.
Huh.
Um, Undead prior, there were some usages of it, but it's like it's not used like that. It just means that someone who didn't die. Uh, it's interesting. Undead he throws out. People don't use it for years, and then H.G. Wells picks it up in the outline of history 20 years later, and that like solidifies
Hmm.
the meaning of the word undead. There is some debate also in this period whether he got into researching Vlad the Impaler as an inspiration for Dracula. And honestly, I'm not smart enough to say what's what, but like people feel really strongly on both sides of this argument. That I found out there's like almost a cottage industry of people arguing whether Dracula is based on Vlad the Impaler or not.
I
Um,
mean, it's the at least in the prose, it's at least in the text of this book, that's the argument that it seems to make, right? That he was this voivode of Wallachia, and that he led these uprisings against the Ottoman Turks, and was ultimately crushed.
People make the argument that because his notes were so detailed about vampire lore and about history, and he never once mentions Vlad the Impaler, some people feel very strongly that that means he's not specifically pulling from that. There's a whole novel, or not a whole novel. There's a whole book called Dracula Was a Woman that's arguing the basis for Dracula was another woman that I forget who in the region. There's a lot of debate about the origins of who Dracula is based on. And again, it's like kind of beyond the scope of what we do here. But I don't know, Scoob, do you have any thoughts or background on this? I'm not expecting you to be a expert on the history here, but
I've heard that before, but like, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, etc., etc. Yeah, it's Vlad the Impaler.
yeah.
In
If
my,
it's yeah. If it's not supposed to be, then he like did a damn good job of making it seem like it is.
It looks like a if it looks like a Dracula, impales like a Dracula.
Um,
I
Oopsie, little
have
son.
my little head of garlic here that I'm snacking on, by the way, so I'm safe from
Oh
all
hell yeah.
Draculas.
You're defended against all Draculas.
Stoker's grandnephew actually lives like smack dab between us. He lives outside of Greenville, South Carolina.
Get out,
Does he
really?
really? What do you know?
He, he's still kicking, and I have a friend down there, and he texted me one night. He was like, "Dude, you will never believe who I just met." It was randomly at some function. He was just there.
That's
Oh,
sick.
wow.
That is very cool. That is very cool.
That's a hell of an icebreaker at parties.
It's like, yeah, so my uncle, yeah. So it's worth noting that Dracula was not super popular when it came out. I don't mean to say it was a commercial failure. People like to over dramatize, like, oh, it was received negatively. No, it's just people didn't really care. It was like fine. The the cover was actually like kind of shoddily done, probably because he changed the title of it 2 weeks before it was supposed to go to print. Um, and he signed his contract 6 days before publication and made no royalty on the first 1,000 sales. He made very little money on this. His mother actually, when she read Dracula, like cried out that he was a genius, that he was set for life, but actually didn't make a lot of money. He was expected to make some money on a film option in the early 1900s, but it turned out he'd fucked up the copyright situation and it lapsed into public domain early. This would ensure Dracula's fame, but it also Stoker's relative poverty.
Well,
Uh,
then, and that's where we get Nosferatu, right?
Yes, which is a legal battle of its own that's, beyond our scope, but yes. Uh, but it remained popular, but not huge until after his death. But it did innovate some things. It brought together a lot of vampire lore that hadn't been brought together before. Now, John William Polidori and Lord
Polidori, yeah.
yeah, and Lord Byron had written The Vampire, about 50 years before this, but as part of a contest between them and the Shelleys, who are also an influence on Stoker. But it's and then of course there's the aforementioned Camilla and stuff, but what you have here is you really have a lot of like the rules of what will become vampires in fiction being really hammered out here, all this folklore kind of being brought together into one place, plus some new inventions of Stoker's. Like Stoker invented the vampires can't see themselves in a mirror. He invented that they can't go over rushing water. Now there are stories of like ghosts and stuff that couldn't pass water before, but he's the one who like was like, no, that's the vampire rule. It's actually Nosferatu that will make it where they can't go in the sunlight. Um,
Oh, yeah, I noticed that. Like Dracula's just kind of walking around,
yeah,
and
bro
like
doesn't
I
give a
kind
fuck.
the gloss that I kind of have in my head was okay. Like it's kind of cloudy in London. Maybe he can just like on an overcast day he's cool. But like that appears nowhere in the text.
It's also worth noting that like it wasn't until like it was like late 18th century there was still scholarly debate about the existence of the undead going on in like polite society. So
That
like this
tracks.
was actually scary to people. Like people were freaked out by this book, like genuinely quite freaked out.
Conan Doyle was a huge believer in phantasmagoria and whatnot.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it like even the most learned, most accepted literati, yeah, it was absolutely perfectly normal to believe in seances, to go on
Hmm.
ghost walks, fairy pictures, and all that.
And it's worth noting, like, even Stoker was friends with J.W. Brody Ennis of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He was around this stuff. A thing I looked at when I was looking into his politics, it seemed that he tried to avoid politics typically, especially like later in life. When he's writing Lady of the Shroud, The Lair of the White Worm, and Personal Reminiscences of Henry Irving, he really liked that guy. Uh, he mostly ducked around it. In fact, he did get involved with an organization. He did get involved with the Freemasons for a few years, and I looked it up, and it was because Irving asked him to. And it's like, dang, he just really followed this guy around. Like, you know, uh, the only real like politics we have from him, aside from like, what we can infer from his writing, which is a lot, but his stated politics is that he called himself a Gladstone liberal. He was very concerned with Irish affairs, but he was not a separatist, pro unions and stuff like that, not a socialist. Um, and he had a period later on, like shortly before his death, where he wrote some like strange stuff about like the need for more government censorship that some people have actually put down to like late stage syphilis. Um, like he was not in his right mind in the last couple of years of his life. And so some people that are like even close to him have said, like, please don't regard some of his last writings as like prime Bram Stoker's opinions. In 1912, he dies of strokes and syphilis. He died not very well known, a bit of a following, but more or less a pulp novelist. And then 10 years later, he is just catapulted to extreme fame, and Dracula is one of the most famous books of all time. And we're talking about it now. So that's my there are biographies, there is debate, there is actually a lot of questions about his childhood, but that is my quick as I can summary of the life of and times of Bram Stoker, who sort of seemed to be the let me see, he's Stoker, but he was more of a spoke on the wheel of all this. I don't know. I don't have anything there. But I did note that I did think of Fred Stoker from Every Young Man's Battle. Wonder any relation there. That's n another grandnephew, perhaps.
Well, especially when we get into the gender politics of this thing, like you do see a little bit of a parallel here.
I mean, doesn't Harker really go through every young man's battle?
He does.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Harker Harker deals with the joggers. The three women are the joggers.
He has he
In the
has
castle.
he has some thoughts about the women of Transylvania specifically as well. What is he like? The women looked pretty except when he got near them, but they were very clumsy about the waist.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
specific.
Presumably, Count Dracula is a couple of mountains over from Countess Butterface.
Got him. J J Jonathan Harker writing Every Young Man's Battle, and he's like, he's writing his analysis. He's like, okay, so on your way to work, yeah, he writes the billboards, he writes the joggers, and then he's like, you're gonna see the swirling mist, and you might think, oh, what odd weather. It's like, no, it's temptation,
Well,
actually. Your
and
wife, don't let her touch wafers.
well,
Don't do it.
and I'm curious, Scoob, like how much of like the because you were about like 9 when you read this, right?
The vast majority, like all of the subtext, just flew right over my head.
Sure.
This was just like vampires.
Yeah, spooky story. That's all, and that's really
Mm,
I'm 40, so I'm a few years older than y'all.
hmm
I was like prime age for when Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula came.
Yeah.
Oh, which I have
Like,
yet to see.
Oh
oh my
yeah.
good God, it's not very true to the book, but it is an amazing movie.
Oh yeah, the
The
films have really made Dracula. Between that, obviously all the Christopher Lee movies, Nosferatu. Now you have like Voyage of the Demeter, Renfield, this new Nosferatu movie. Um, I,
Nosferatu.
Nosferatu, yeah. Tried to like get an accurate count of the amount of times Dracula has showed up in various media properties, and like I gave up when I was well over 1,200 like major media properties that have featured Dracula in some capacity, and I was like, okay, you get the idea. It's a fucking lot.
Oh yeah, no, and I mean it's in terms of the disparity, right, between the reach that this guy has in his life and the Titanic influence after. He's a very Lovecraft-esque figure, right?
It's interesting, even like a few years after he died, his wife, to be clear, it seemed like they didn't have a very close marital relationship, but they were very good friends. A lot of people commented on they like didn't seem like, again, it's once again fueling the rumors, who knows, but they were very good friends, at least. They were very close. And she published some of his unwritten or his unpublished stories after he died, including the first chapter of Dracula, which was not published. Um, and like even after he died, like 5 years after his death, there was like a clamoring for this first chapter of Dracula that there had not been 5 years prior.
Hmm.
Um, like it's interesting. Like the book was in print and stuff. It's in like even before Nosferatu came out, like there was a Hungarian adaptation in like 1920 that like predates. There's just like
Is that like lost media now? Can we still find it?
I think it's lost media.
Ah,
I couldn't find it. There might be something somewhere. I didn't look too deep. But like because like it even said on Wikipedia like supposedly it was shown whatever. So that makes me think that we can't, find it. But it is interesting that like this was kind of boy like there was an undercurrent, and even like people commenting on Dracula were like, yeah, it was always popular with like, you know, they said like college age students and stuff like that, like literature students, like always really loved it, you know,
Mhm.
and housewives were scandalized but couldn't put it down, another critic said, which I found to be funny. Um, which there's a lot of that in this too. Scandalized housewives who yet couldn't look away.
Yeah, the idea of, this dark figure that can essentially come and go as he pleases once he's been invited, and is, alluring and eventually like draws you into his sort of his sphere and his what's the word that I'm looking for?
His Dracula.
Yeah, he draws you into his Dracula and then you're just done.
You get he says get Dracula'd and it's fucking over for you.
Mhm. Yeah,
Uh,
let's get into the beginning here. Like what really struck me about the opening of Nosferatu is, of course, it's a German dude because it's the story is transplanted to like northern Germany in the film. What really struck me is that Nosferatu hews very closely to the first couple of chapters of Dracula, where the main guy in this book, Jonathan Harker, is traveling to Eastern Europe to sell a house to a dude. And everything around him is obviously evil. Like there are people crossing themselves when they figure out like where he's going. Like there are people who are engaging in like all kinds of like protective rituals and whatnot. And he's just kind of like, yeah, these are like really quaint like Eastern Europeans stuck in their ways. Like these people are weird. They speak a weird language and dress in weird clothes. Um, and that's his focus, like all the way up to Castle Dracula.
It's funny as the unpublished first chapter has even more of that. He like gets stranded in a cemetery and attacked by wolves, and there's like ghosts and stuff, and like warnings saying do not go forward, and like a woman like desperately begging him not to. Like it's like his publisher basically told him like we're not putting this chapter in, it's too much, which is pretty
Mm.
funny because to be told like this is Victorian literature, but we got to put our foot down on drama somewhere.
My favorite line from like this first bit is it seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What ought they to be in China?
God.
Just that
Turns out much quicker and more efficient, but you
that's
know,
true.
maybe not at this time, I suppose.
It's just like the when kid logic kind of makes it to adulthood, you know? Like,
I like that he won't stop bitching because he had spicy food. He had paprika for the first time.
oh, that's actually important though, because like it's the first mention of Mina Harker, right? Like he has this red pepper chicken recipe and he's like, "Oh, I got to get this to like have my GF make it."
Hmm. But he's also like, ah, it's very strong. And he's like he likes it, but it's a little too much for him. Like paprika is kind of kicking his English ass.
Mm,
Recipes firmly establishes him as a wife guy.
That is true.
yes.
Deviled eggs are called deviled eggs because they have pepper and paprika on them.
That's
That's
true.
true.
So yeah, white people hate spicy shit.
I guess so. They're like, this is Satan, actually. They're looking at the egg, just horrified. Um, so and he's approaching Castle Dracula. You know, he's a solicitor. I find it interesting, like I don't know, I laugh almost every time early in this where it's like the word Dracula to me is like synonymous with vampire. So I'm like, bro, you're going to Castle Dracula? You should know there's a Dracula in there. But like
Mm,
everybody, every time they use the word Dracula, like, oh, the exact locality of Castle Dracula. I don't know why. I find the use of the word itself to be very amusing. But, you know, a driver comes, takes him up the hill. It's all very creepy. You know, you have this moment where it's, quote, at last there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had yet gone, and during his absence the horses began to tremble worse than ever, and to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it, for the howling of wolves had ceased altogether. But just then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling, pine-clad rock, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves with white teeth and lolling red tongues, with long sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than ever when they howled. I felt sort of paralyzed with fear. It is only when a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. And I could go on, but it's this type of dramatic writing. The whole thing is very much suffused with this. Um, and I think there are moments in this that can get a little like repetitive in some of its language, but this stuff is very effective to me. I think these grand explanations of these things, these red lolling tongues, it picks out very specific details and then can leave other things to the imagination, the sort of the stuff in the shadows of what the character's getting. And I think that's effective. I think it's also worth noting that all of this is an epistolary. All of this is being written as letters, notes, diary entries of the various characters in the novel. Um, and so there is some slight difference between characters. And yeah, Jonathan is really going in at just how scary these fucking wolves are as he goes up towards Castle Dracula. Da da da.
Yeah,
Uh,
he's really got he nails the vibe that you get of somebody who's just here for business and who's read a little bit about like these environs of Eastern Europe. Because he does zero in on very specific like geographical and historical elements of the places he's at, right? It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bistritz, which is a very interesting old place. Being practically on the frontier, for the Borgo Pass leads from it into Bukovina, it has had a very stormy existence, and it certainly shows marks of it. 50 years ago, a series of great fires took place, which made terrible havoc on 5 separate occasions. At the very beginning of the 17th century, it underwent a siege of 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people, the casualties of war proper being assisted by famine and disease. And then, he gets to his hotel, and it's like, okay,
he's
okay.
just info dumping
Yeah,
in his own diary.
But
Little
in
monks
fair,
does.
but yeah, in fairness, like it's the sort of shit that I get into. He would totally like lose an afternoon to a Wikipedia deep dive.
Mm. Perhaps on Castle Dracula. If he had only checked the Wikipedia page for Castle Dracula, we might have been
Mm.
saved a lot of pain. He says, well, it doesn't have any direct references to Vlad the Impaler, but I'm getting vibes.
Occasionally, there's a dude crawling out of the window.
Yeah. So, they approach the castle, and Scoob, what is to me, this is one of the most effective parts of the book. I don't know, like I think, we were talking about a little bit about like different vampires and different vampire lore. And for me, this is I want to know if you agree and how you feel about this. So like definitive in how I think about vampires, even before I'd even read this. This just image of Castle Dracula rising in the distance is just so fucking iconic. I don't know. I love it. I don't know if you had any thoughts on this first part here as he's climbing towards the castle.
Yeah, no, totally. Also, you were talking about it being an epistolary. I thought Stoker was actually really good at sort of changing the voice
Yeah.
he writes
Yeah.
as characters. The women notwithstanding, he writes about what you would expect a Victorian guy to write as a woman.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sure.
From the captain of the Demeter to Seward to Harker, like he could really blend characters very well. But yeah, as far as Castle Dracula, it's iconic. Like Lenore, you mentioned Castlevania earlier, talking about Camilla. Like
Mm.
that's it. You
Hmm.
know, you see just this daunting, looming edifice, and you know, a damn Dracula lives there. Holy shit!
Yeah.
It,
Yeah, no, for sure. He's defined by his lair, and he's defined by the fact that it's almost a landform, It's a mountain, right? It's a forest. It's something that has been part of the landscape for so long that people have just kind of built their civilizations and folklore around it.
Hmm.
hmm And it's like clearly the people all know something's up, but they also can't do anything about it. It's become a fixture in their lives.
Mm.
Um, Now, and I think, and then this obviously goes into as this presence will invade London, there is something of the sort of foreign otherness to it that makes this necessary for it to like, Stoker is writing for the Anglo mind specifically for his contemporaries in London and then high society in Dublin and whatnot. So he's very much like this is. And he says it coming up. This is the barbarian East. Yeah, he uses, words we don't use for Romani people. He talks about these people as kind of a different species altogether, Slavs and whatnot, almost the way he portrays it. And I don't know as much about Stoker's own personal beliefs and what he's trying to make his characters say because they're characters. But there is this feeling of like you have come into this land of the other, and now you now have the danger of now that the world has grown with the railroads, they might not run on time over here, but with the railroads, with the checkbooks, with the solicitors who can carry out their paperwork. Now there is the power of the other to come to us. Um,
Mm.
and I think there's definitely, and reading sort of some of what some of the contemporaries were writing about this, um, a lot of people who read this, whether this was Stoker's intention or not, felt like some of this was about like feeling invaded by the alien, and by that I mean like immigrants and whatnot. There was in the 90s, the 1890s, there was this big influx of Jewish immigrants into the United Kingdom, and I do wonder how much of and there are some in some Eastern European as well. A lot of those were from Eastern Europe. So I wonder how much of that comes from, it's something I throw out here, but it's like, I wonder how much of that is you're supposed to sort of feel and infer as you're approaching the castle. But for me, obviously not reading it from that context, I'm just kind of getting it as this grand magic place. And I think that it still works effectively with whether or not he's trying to dog whistle here something or not.
Well, invaded, and also like as a prerequisite to that, studied, right?
Sure.
Because there is a bit where he's in Dracula's castle early on, and he's really taken in by the furniture. He's like, oh yeah, I saw something like this back in Hampton Court, back home in England, right? But there they were worn and frayed and moth-eaten. Here they're like brand new and really well kept, right? So somebody who has made an effort at least to sort of like vibe with his home culture, right?
Hmm.
Um, he keeps a whole library of English books about like the culture and the history and like every aspect of it. The bit where Jonathan's like, it somehow gladdened my heart to see it. The law list, which is, I looked this up. It's a registry of names of judges and lawyers in England, right? So he's glad he's somewhere where the laws of his land are recognized, right? Where you could look up a solicitor if you needed
Peak nerd
one.
shit.
Yeah,
Peak nerd shit
yeah.
right there. But Jonathan he's a lawyer, he's a solicitor. This is what he does. He's the paper guy.
Mm,
Um
Grasping for familiarity, right? Like
yes.
mhm.
I know who those people are
Mm,
in
He's like,
this
yeah.
weird place, this uncanny feeling. They use uncanny a lot.
Hmm. Which it's a good word, and the guy in Dracula really is the only guy in his castle aside from some ghostly women that show up a couple times. It's funny because there's the guy who drives his carriage and presumably somebody who's making the food, but it turns out it's just all Dracula like running around
Doing
probably.
his laundry, making us, throwing a Pop Tart in, whatever you
Yeah,
need.
I appreciate that, like the energy of Dracula to keep up this sort of grand scam is like, okay, now I'm gonna go over here, and he like takes off his cloak, and I like that Jonathan immediately is like, oh, that's the same guy. Like it's not. It's funny because Dracula is cunning, but he has also got a sort of childlike mind, which they identify later in this book. Like he actually has, in some ways, a mind that is not fully developed in certain capacities which Van Helsing talks about at length, as he talks about many things. He loves to talk at length. Um, but Dracula here is very different than like the version we see in most media, this sort of suave, polished. What it says is within stood an old man, clean shaven, save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of color about him anywhere. And I think that's I think that's interesting. The long mustache. When you think of like the different versions we have more of like the short trimmed, or you rarely see the gray hair with Dracula. But of course, in this book, Dracula becomes younger when he drinks blood, which I think is cool.
This is a wildly xenophobic book,
Yeah.
what you were talking about. And, you talk about invasion. And I think Stoker kind of foreshadows that, or, sets the theme with their conversation that night, where Dracula keeps Stoker up till daybreak. And then he's like, oh, well, time to head out, because he's
Mhm.
talking about like the wars that his family line had won and fought.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that just sets up the xenophobia and the fear of invasion, the fear of corruption.
Mhm. Yeah, he's talking about himself, about Transylvanian history. And he says, I won't try to do a Dracula voice, just I'll be, I can't do the accent, but he says, we have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Here in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit which Thor and Woden gave him, which their berserkers displayed to fell intent on the seaboards of Europe, aye, and of Asia and Africa too. And he goes on and talks about the Huns and the Turks and the Grand Wars. Like you mentioned, you can read the book. I won't read it all for you, but it's like it's also funny that like I remember making a joke to my husband. I was like, Dracula's kind of racist too. Dracula is like the type of like interper Dracula is so racist that it's just his family line that's pure blood. Nobody else, no one else counts. It's Dracula and maybe those three women, wherever they came from. Uh, it's like everybody else isn't a real white person except Dracula in his mind. Um, so he
Well,
is this foreign invader, and he has this history of invasion and this violent culture. It really sets them up as like, oh, well, they come from
yeah.
the Huns,
Yes,
that
yes.
it's that kind of thing,
I was just thinking that, yeah, because like, before, of course, like the shorthand like group for evil, right? You bring up this group and you're like, oh yeah, yeah, like you're comparing them to these guys, they're evil. Nazis, right?
Mhm.
Hitler, right? You think of that, you're immediately like, okay, this is the worst thing you can be. And before all that, it was like invading hordes like Huns, right? The Turk had
Mm.
its day as like the ultimate like villain in European Christendom.
But Lenore, the Turk is lusting to control Vienna. I promise, Lenore, one more crusade, and Vienna will be safe forever. I promise you.
They can have Vienna, like
Can you
I've
imagine how much cooler Vienna would be if it had like more Eastern aesthetic to it? Yeah,
it would be a lot better, I tell you what.
yeah. The Turk lusts. He is at the
Mm.
gates of Vienna. Very dramatic.
But
It's funny. The Hell on Earth podcast, the series talking about the 30 Years War, they made that joke endlessly, and they were like, "But we must always turn to the Turk, who now lusts for Vienna." And like the Turks are just like minding their own business. But go on. Sorry.
yeah, no, but and among all the like parochiality of the text, right? Among all the like, stranger in a strange land stuff, we get to page 40, at least in my edition of the book. After the mundanity of all the shop talk, of all the, this is the history, these are the people who live here and how weird they are, Slovaks, am I right? Like
Mhm.
suddenly you get this. As I leaned from the window, my eye was caught by something moving a story below me, and somewhat to my left, where I imagined, from the lie of the rooms, that the windows of the Count's own room would look out. The window at which I stood was tall and deep, stone mullioned, and though weather worn, was still complete. But it was evidently many a day since the case had been there. I drew back behind the stonework and looked carefully out. What I saw was the Count's head coming out from the window. I did not see the face, but I knew the man by the neck and the movement of his back and arms. In any case, I could not mistake the hands which I had had so many opportunities of studying. I was at first interested and somewhat amused, for it is wonderful how small a matter will interest and amuse a man when he is a prisoner. But my very feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and began to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first, I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow, but I kept looking, and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of years, and by thus using every projection and inequality, move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along the wall.
So sick.
That's the first overtly like supernatural thing we see, and it's fucking scary. Now that you have 39 pages to be primed against that.
Mm.
Yeah, and
Scoob.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, the film, just calling it a cloak, a cape, does not do it justice. It's blood red. It has this enormously long train behind it.
Mm.
And so you get to see him climb out the window, and he scurries like a spider.
Mhm.
Oh, God.
It's I think they may have overcranked the camera or something to give it just a little bit of an edge of this unseemliness.
Yeah.
It's
And that's what I think is effective in this book is like there are moments where it really goes for it and it is really blood and gore, but most of the effective horror scenes in this book are it's the uncanniness, it's a little unseemly, it's a little like this is out of sorts, right? Like Jonathan later on is like, okay, I can figure out how to navigate this wall. But this guy crawling and skittering like a lizard, this old man, just the little thing, not little things, obviously it's a big thing to see, but the way that it feels, unnatural. And it doesn't have to go too far, right? He didn't have to roar and fire come out. Like he did that. And that limited thing that he wasn't supposed to see uh is enough to be like, oh shit, what is up with this castle? And then of course he checks the doors and they're all locked. And it's just, scary as hell. Uh Jonathan, of course, also brave fella, figures out how to climb around on the walls here, and he finds, Dracula's where Dracula sleeps, which is of course in a grave. He is a vampire. Um, and is not really able to do much about it, but he's freaked out, and Dracula is in the process of planning his grand trip to London, where Dracula will be moving to London and buying, multiple properties there, for some devious purpose. And it's interesting. Like you have a lot here that's setting up the rest of the book, and I think there's a sentence here that's interesting that I noted, that says, and yet, unless my senses deceived me, the old centuries had and have powers of their own which mere modernity cannot kill.
I have
And
that exact line written down.
yeah, and modernity is in quotes, and I feel like that's as close to like a thesis statement about like what Dracula is as almost anything. I mean, it can represent different things, but like this clash of this old world that we still have not reconciled with, right? Like we have it all. We have the steamships, we have the trains, we have the lights, all these things that they've invented, now the 20th century approaches, and it's like but there's this old shit that we can't quite grasp. Like you said, Scoob, like Arthur Conan Doyle is like trying to talk to ghosts. These people they're still dealing with these lands that every time they go a little further, the world's a little bigger and there's more than they know, and there's myths and they're not sure where things collide, and then there's new science that's throwing their perception out of whack. It's it's very interesting, and there was this fear that like, oh, in our like, hallowed city of London where the lights are so bright, we won't be able to see the things that are coming in the dark. And you can have the xenophobic element of that, which it is meaning that, but you also have the actually just very scary element of like, oh shit, well, what is it that we're missing in our so-called knowledge?
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. Well, Darwin had published Origin on the Species 30-ish, 30 odd years before
Yeah.
this. So, that kind of sets up, okay, so mankind was the apex of creation. We know this.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes, well, no, if this is correct, if evolution is correct, no, we're part of something else.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, 30 years later, they're still wrestling with that. They're still grappling with that. So it becomes, are the old ways better?
Yeah.
Reject this modernity?
And people are also seeing the downsides of modernity, and they haven't quite seen the true ugliness of modernity yet in the Western world. They'll see that in the 1910s when World War One comes around, when they really see the shit. But like they're starting to see that, and even like the little wars that pop off in like the Balkans and stuff, when that happens, they're suddenly getting body counts way higher than they like these. There are elements of modernity that are suddenly really scary to people that they weren't quite ready with.
Oh yeah.
And I also find it interesting that I didn't get quite into this, but Bram Stoker was actually quite interested in the occult, but he wanted to know the literal things. He was very much of the belief in his life. First of all, he was a Protestant. He wasn't like, breaking from that Protestantism or anything, very devout. But he felt very strongly that there were occult things and they could be understood with science and they just hadn't been figured out yet. So he was very interested in like the sort of blend between hypnotism and spirits, and he went to like all kinds of people like that. But he apparently would get enraged at anyone that was doing a trick, right? If you were a fortune teller and you were using tricks to figure out how to, which is like most people are going for a fun experience. Bram Stoker was like, no, show me the math. Show me how you did this mathematically. And of course, that's not how most people are experiencing this. But you can see in Dracula, especially with like Van Helsing and characters like this, which we'll get to shortly, this is actually a lot of Bram Stoker's own feelings around it coming in.
No, it's the synthesis of old ways and the modern.
Hmm.
Excuse
And the way to synthesize it properly, in my opinion, is to give Dracula a smartphone. But go ahead, Lenore.
Well, yeah, and I mean, this book came out in 1897. What came out 2 years before that? The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, right?
Hmm.
Very early, very early what we call weird fiction, right? It's horror. It would go on to influence Lovecraft later on. Like it's part and parcel of this horror scene that is grappling in part with the much less significant place that humanity occupies in this world and in, the worlds beyond it, right? In, Lovecraft's case, perhaps it's the like Anglosphere, right? Britain, like, he, in his estimation, the height of human civilization being displaced, right?
Yeah, this is still the empire.
Hmm.
Yes, the sun never sets. And he is now like, in trying to escape the castle, comes across these three women, who there's this interesting interaction with them that like despite the women not playing a prominent role, super prominent role in the novel, there's a lot of writing about them. Any book that's this prominent is just gonna have a lot of writing around it. But there's these women that are like very attractive, um, and they're whispering to each other, and he's getting like almost controlled by them. And one says, "Go on, you are first, and we shall follow." And the other said, "He is young and strong. There were kisses for all." And he says, he smelled blood on their voice, and it said, I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her lips and teeth, and I could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of her lips on touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with a beating heart. And then the count like interrupts and he declares, I will have him first and then you will have him, which is actually a thing that they had to Well, that's said later, but that's a thing they actually cut from the British editions that got censored because it was too
Racist.
suggestive of, what it's saying. The American edition
Mm.
allowed the Count to say, "I will have him," and then "you will have him," which even then isn't saying that. But um, but this is
What's the opposite of I can fix her?
she doesn't need to be fixed.
Or like she can unfix me? Cause
She can break me.
yeah, why not? Why ever
Lenore, are
not?
you into the vampire bitches? Are you into the
I
vampire women?
I I can neither confirm nor deny.
Okay, okay, I understand. So do you think Lucy would have been better as a vampire?
Literally, Lucy was peak Lucy up until page 204 where she dies. Like
R.I.P. Lucy.
she was living her best on life.
But yeah,
Lucy did
this
nothing wrong.
to be clear, I read on someone asked what the trio of vampire women were called on Reddit at one point, and someone said, I believe they're referred to as the vampire bitches, and I thought that was very funny.
Why not? We
Lucy,
we could all use some vampire bitches in our lives.
that's what I'm saying. Lenore's trying to be one, I think. And Arthur,
Not succeeding so far because as we said, I'm nibbling on this garlic right now.
yeah, not yet. You're seeing when it kicks in. I mean, it seems, it seems our protagonist here was about to be one. It seems Jonathan was about to join their ranks, but prevented by Dracula, who was trying to have his own fun. But
Hmm.
again, it's a very sexual thing, and I think I read some literature around this that people made the note that even between Jonathan and these women, Victorian society, what is it known for? These very, very strict gender roles, right? And so this idea even of a woman coming on to a man and this man enjoying a woman doing something to him in any capacity is actually is a transgressive idea in this literature and was actually seen as scandalous by some of the reviewers, which obviously pretty absurd. And also like, yeah, sounds like they don't like to have fun, but like, like,
But it wouldn't
you
have been
know,
written if there hadn't been something if people weren't looking for it, right?
yes. Yes. And also the notable about the biting is a literal penetration, which later they will literally compare blood to cum. Like they will actually do it in this novel. I'm not the one making the comparison. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. You know what I mean? But her like literally wanting to suck the blood out of him, the essence out of him. Um, and the idea of that blood being shared with a body as like a sexual ritual, which is a thing like Arthur talks about later in the book. And then Van Helsing jokes, well, then we all had sex with your wife. uh, but like it's a very horny and racy book. I mean, like even now, like that's a pretty racy scene, but like for the
Hmm.
time, like that was like Bram Stoker like felt the censors breathing on his neck when he was writing this. He did.
Yeah, when did you start when did you first start getting the sense of that aspect of it, Scoob? I'm curious.
Like me personally, like how old was I?
Well, I mean, just what kind of made it click? Like, was it some other like Dracula media that really leaned into this aspect of it that you were like, oh, that's what I was reading?
Yeah. There's a Hammer film called Count Varna.
Count Varna.
Not familiar.
I believe it's Varna. I forget. I saw it years upon years ago, but it is a step away from softcore pornography. Like,
Makes
uh,
sense.
yeah, Varna, the Count, the main character, is this rogue, and he's just super horny, and he just roams Europe, getting maidens left and right.
Adding to the ranks of the vampire trio. I like the idea that Count Dracula has like lived hundreds of years and like I don't know why like why does and there's these three women he's decided to like keep with him. And I'm curious like do you have any thoughts on like why does Dracula just have this trio of random women here? Why these women? Why this group here? What's Dracula's play? What's going on here? Because I actually have questions, and we'll get to it a little later on, but like Dracula's plan in general, I do wonder about.
I think it's just the polygamy aspect. I think that's just like what people are supposed to look at and be shocked by. Oh, he's got three baddies hanging around the castle. That's
Yeah,
weird.
He's got four baddies hanging around the castle. Jonathan Harker is a baddie.
I I'm is Jonathan Harker your I can fix him character?
No, he's not. He's petty bourgeois.
I
He's
was about to
canceled.
say, like, it's he and I just wouldn't see eye to eye. I don't know, Scoop. What about you?
No, Jonathan Harker, no, absolutely not. He's not a baddie. Englishman that sits at a desk all day.
That's
Mm,
true. Dracula seems to think he is, but that, maybe we
Dracula,
can't trust his opinion.
yeah, he's a creepy old pervert.
He is. He
mm.
is. Until he drinks blood, and then he's a creepy young pervert. Well,
But
to move it along, Jonathan escapes and Dracula is on his way. Dracula is headed for London on the Demeter on a ship, which like kind of closes the first act of the novel. Um, and the thing, and Jonathan manages to escape by crawling down the wall face, and he ends up getting found by like some nuns. He goes pretty crazy, and not even that he's crazy, it's that he feels crazy because he thought he dreamed up everything. And because of his Victorian literature, people love to talk about like diseases of the mind and fevers of the brain and melancholy, and like they love to talk about like your brain feeling bad in this era of literature, and Jonathan is right there with it.
Mm. Well, and that's what intrigues me about his escape, right? Is that, we mentioned earlier that, yeah, like the modern age has forgotten like these particular aspects of superstition and magic that this guy can weaponize against us. So what does Jonathan have to do? Like he has to he has to learn to climb like Dracula does and get out of the castle that way. It foreshadows a real sort of attention to like the old ways, right?
yeah,
That is true.
the vampire hunters mirror Dracula quite a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Another person who mirrors Dracula is a character we now get introduced, which is a fellow by the name of, well, several fellows now get introduced, but we get to meet R.M. Renfield around now. The insane patient who the guy in the mental asylum who is sort of Dracula's. It's not actually technically Dracula's thrall, I don't think, but he is following Dracula. I don't think he's actually following under the rules. You get at this point Mina Harker, you get Quincy Morris, you get Arthur, you get
Texas mentioned.
they throw all the characters at you here. Like you had Jonathan and Dracula, and then all of a sudden it's like, and here's all the guys, and the two women.
And half of them want to bang Lucy.
I maybe more. And then when Lucy dies, they all turn their attention on Mina. They're all like,
Mm.
"This is the greatest woman who's ever lived in the entire world."
There is a lot of the exemplar about this book, right? They have to find this person who they can hold up as like the ideal woman, like the standard of human purity. Like you be like this person and you'll go to heaven, and it's important that we send this person to heaven.
But yeah, we now, as of chapter 5, we get Mina Murray, who will become Mina Harker, and Lucy uh
Westenra.
Westenra. And Mina to me is my favorite character in this book. I like Mina a lot.
She's a nerd.
She is. She's a complete dork.
Hmm.
Okay, so one thing I find interesting, I want to know if y'all agree. I find this book with all characters, especially the women, but to be very like it can be very reductive. It really can be reductive on gender, and it really can be like take a character and like really not want them to have flaws, like they're extremely noble and extremely cool. And despite that, character still does come through in a way that in most stories where the characters, where it really, really emphasizes their virtue, I feel like most of those type of stories, it's like, okay, this is a very flat character. But I think I like do have a sense of these characters in a way that books like this usually fail to get them across to me. I don't know. What do y'all think? Because I think like despite all this, Mina's individuality comes through. Arthur's individuality comes. Like I think all these people have, and maybe it's because I'm getting to hear their voice in their journal. I don't know. What do y'all think of that?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like he really manages to capture a different voice for each entry,
Hmm.
and that's really impressive because like you said, he wasn't. He was a theater critic.
Yeah.
He wasn't a full time novelist.
Hmm.
So and especially, this is like his breakout work. This is his first real work besides a few short stories and whatnot. Like,
Hmm.
it's very effective.
I think what it is he's writing at this time a lot of letters. He writes a lot of letters and he's responding to letters, like he's responding to letters from not fans, but people commenting on his column. He's writing other writers. Like he is in the business of writing letters and he's writing letters for his friend. He's writing letters on behalf. So he's got these different voices he's working on in his own life, right? And I think that he's, and he's got some skill, of course, in the research. And I think through that, he's able to do what he does and pulls off here very effectively. It works really well as an epistolary, and it also feels a little bit like found. You think of a found footage movie. It almost feels like found media. Like, wow, I found this compendium of forbidden knowledge. They don't want you to know this, but this really happened just yesterday. I know there's some people who do the Dracula challenge where they go through the year and they read the entries by the day, like so the May 9th
Mm.
entries, they on May 9th will read that. And so through the year they read a little bit of Dracula. Not every day, but like, every few days or whatever.
Yeah, and that's like May through like November, I believe, is when they track him down and get him. So like that'll take you through half the year.
Yes. Um, so it's worth noting that so Mina is Jonathan's fiance, and Lucy is her best friend. I think it should be noted that all of these characters in the book come from privileged classes. They are all comfortable. Now, some of them are more comfortable than others, right? Lucy comes from like money, right? Mina and Jonathan, their lawyer, they're in that like lawyer, she was a teacher, but they're in this upper comfortable strata and they are set to inherit a shit ton of money. Um, Arthur is like literally about going to become a lord. That's the guy that Lucy is into. Quincy Morris, it's unclear. He's like a fucking fur trapper or something. They were like, yeah, he's just an American. They all have money. Um,
Yeah, he talks about like adventures that he had in the wilderness, like shooting bears and whatnot.
I like that they have like Yosemite Sam. Like he literally at one point sees a bird and he's like, I got to go outside and shoot that bird.
Yeah, well,
Like the American archetype is
he
funny.
goes out, he shoots the bird, and like he breaks the window, like the bullet like embeds itself in the wall, almost hits Mina, I think. Like,
Hmm.
and he's just like, yeah, it's America. What are you gonna do?
And then you have Dr. John Seward, who is a psychiatric doctor. And again, he's comfortable, but he's not like super, super crazy well off. But again, they're all upper class. They can all afford to have men wait on them, attendants and stuff. And then a little later on, you'll get the last main character, which is Van Helsing, which is he's
Yes.
the goated vampire hunter.
Yes, Willem
Uh,
Dafoe himself. That by the way, Van Helsing from like '04, I think, still one of my favorite fucking films.
Not seen it, actually.
Oh, okay, that's gonna be our vampire night.
2004 Van Helsing. Scoob, have you seen this?
Oh yeah, it's a guilty pleasure. It's but it's a lot of fun. The CGI does CGI does not hold up, but it's a good time. Did either of you read The Origins of Quincy Morris?
The
No.
Origins? No, I have not. Is that like a
Okay.
short story?
No, 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 no. The story behind why Quincy Morris is even there because he
Oh
makes
no.
no being there. Okay, Wild Bill Hickok.
Also, before you say this, to be clear for the listeners, if you've not read Dracula, or don't know the story, Quincy Morris is a random American who's hanging around who just proposes to Lucy on a day where three people proposed to her. She turns down two of them, decides to marry Arthur, and they all like are pretty cool about it and stay friends. So that's Quincy Morris's deal. But yeah, Scoob, I don't know this, so yeah, let us know.
Okay, Wild Bill Hickok. You're familiar?
Yeah,
Hmm.
So cowboy. So
Yeah.
yeah,
he
yeah.
had he had a traveling show at this time,
Mm.
and there were Native Americans, there were shootings, there were bull riding, and all this. He came to England, and Bram Stoker saw it and just became enamored. He was like a 5-year-old in the 50s with cowboys.
Wow.
I mean, he loved it. When he came to America, he tracked Hickok down and saw the show again. And he loved Texans and the larger than life. And uh, we haven't talked about it, but the Stoker writes phonetically, kind of when or not phonetically, but Van Helsing and Morris. He uses slang and idioms.
Hmm.
It's comical with Morris.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
it is
Like
very funny.
he asks Lucy if she wants to get in the yoke with him or something.
The
It's a
yoke.
it's a horse reference or something.
Oh, it's very funny. Let me see
Uh,
if I can find that actually.
I must tell you beforehand that Mr. Morris doesn't always speak slang. That is to say, he never does so to strangers or before them, for he is really well educated and has exquisite manners. But he found out that it amused me to hear him talk American slang, and whenever I was present and there was no one to be shocked, he said such funny things.
Yeah, he says, this is my Morris voice. Miss Lucy, I know I ain't good enough to regulate the fixings of your little shoes, but I guess if you wait till you find a man that you will, you'll go join them alongside of me and let us go down the long road together, driving in double harness. He's just a simple country lawyer. But it is an over the top American whatever. It's a guy who's carrying around a gun who's always like, when I was on the hunt. He's got a Bowie knife, you know. He's gonna be the guy who really like takes the blade later on. So I make sense why he was like, I gotta have an American in here. I like that Stoker was like a weeb for America. That's pretty funny. Like, he's like in American culture, they say. Yeah. The America culture, they prioritize, whatever. But without getting like too granular in all the plot, because we'll be here forever. This is a long book. Lucy is gonna get bit by a vampire, by Dracula, when he lands after the Demeter has its dramatic voyage. We get to read the captain's logs. It's a whole fucking shit show as the men went insane on there. It's a very creepy, creepy scene. Um, and there's these three men who are really into her. One of them being, the doctor, and Dr. Seward is also taking care of this guy Renfield, who is a patient at a psychiatric ward. Some people actually made fun of this book when it came out. Some of the critics that didn't like it because they felt like it was like doing too many things at once. They were like, you got the asylum, you've got the vampire, you've got the creepy smoke, they thought he was throwing too many things in at once. I love it. I think it's fun. I think you're doing all the conventions, just go for it. And clearly people agree. Um, and like these three guys are gonna be, yeah, they have their personality to them, but they are kind of paragons of virtue. But Lucy and Mina are friends, and Lucy is gonna get extremely sick with the dying disease, with the vampirism, with the, whatever they've got in Dark Souls or whatever it is. She's wasting away dramatically. Um, and it is a sad time. In that they have to call in the expert, the man himself, Van Helsing, the expert doctor, and has knowledge of the arcane and whatnot. And these scenes are all set in this same area where Stoker was actually, first came up with the concept of Dracula, Whitby on the coast, which is notable.
It's interesting to me, like Mina is like her hobby is like journaling, right? Noting down everything she hears, transcribing accents and whatnot. She wants to be like a journalist, right? She wants to be like a woman of letters who like people will refer to what she writes for like some kind of time capsule of her like era, right? There's a bit when they're down by the beach at Whitby and she's talking to three old sailors, old sea captains, right? And like she has these romantic notions about people buried at sea that they disabuse her of. They're like, yeah, like half the people buried in this graveyard, I know they're not buried there, right? Because they're lost at sea, right? What do we do with that exactly? Because you get the sense, I think, that there's certain superstitions that the modern day still holds that are wrong, not because they're superstitions, but because they don't have any material basis. Whereas, like, if you're in Eastern Europe and like you're, carrying garlic around, there's something to that.
Hmm. So you're saying like why is it that the superstitions in like their part of their neck of the woods don't hold anything, but the
Mm,
other ones aren't?
yeah, I wasn't sure what to make of this whole sequence.
Hmm. I haven't thought of that.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the dichotomy of the modern world and this savage old world.
Hmm.
You know, we know we've banished the shadows here.
Hmm.
There, the shadows still reign. You know,
Hmm. And so they also retain that knowledge.
right? And again, Van Helsing is he straddles the line between the old and the new.
That's true.
That's right.
It says, a philosopher and a metaphysician and one of the most advanced scientists of his day. And he has, I believe, an absolutely open mind. This, with an iron nerve, a temper of the ice brook, an indomitable resolution, self-command, and toleration, exalted from virtues to blessings, and the kindliest and truest of hearts that beat. These form his equipment for the noble work that he's doing for mankind. And then he shows up and he's just an old man who, like every woman he meets, is like, you are the greatest woman in the entire world. I will do anything. I will swear my life to your service. Which I think is very funny.
But that goes back to old world charming.
Yeah,
You know,
Hmm.
the old chivalry and courtliness. Let's call
no
it that.
doubt.
There is definitely something to him being from the continent. Yeah.
Hmm.
Just a little fur, like not so far east that like you're weird, in Harka's estimation, but like, he's a Dutchman. He's got a little bit of that flavor.
Yes, exactly.
During this period, Lucy's mother passes away of a fright. Lucy is sort of wearing away. You and it's all kind of a slow creeping. We all know what's coming. There's the unfortunate, Van Helsing is trying to use garlic, trying to use all this stuff. And at this point, he's being cagey about what's going on because he knows and he knows nobody else will believe him. Uh but Lucy bites the dust. Lucy dies. Lucy and then they're like, oh, it's over. And Van Helsing's like, he's like, if only it were over. But then he like tries to put a cross on her chest to like hold her down. But like one of the maids steals a cross or something like that. Um, and which of course they're gonna end up having to like do the whole thing that Lenore read at the top to deal with Lucy's body later on because she goes vampire mode. She's vampire maxing, no doubt.
Yeah, there's a couple of newspaper articles about the Bloofer lady, which is Bloofer being like a bastardization of beautiful, right? Because they
I was
interview.
wondering about that. They say bloofer, and I was thinking like
Yeah,
blooper, like from Paper Mario, but I was imagining the squid from
the
Paper
squid.
Mario. I was imagining the squid from Paper Mario.
Oh God,
I
like
knew it wasn't that, but like that's the only thing that came to my mind.
if she turned into like the vampire hell squid that lives in like the South Pacific, like off the. Have you read about that thing?
No, and I don't know if I want to know. What the fuck? There's a vampire squid in real life?
I think that's what its name translates to. It's like nomenclature, binomial nomenclature. That's what the Latin name translates to is vampire hell squid. Um, she doesn't turn into that, but it'd be a really wild book if she did. But yeah, no, like she called the Bloofer lady because that's it's just a bastardization of beautiful because like some kids saw like her like stalking the night and some of them got.
They got got. They didn't die, but they got got.
Mm.
And they always showed up. Um, and so Van Helsing has to break it to everyone, including Arthur, the fiance. Like, yo, just gotta let you know. Yeah, sorry, she's a vampire. And he even says to John, his friend, which wild that we have a John and a Jonathan. He didn't have to do that to us, but he did. He says, "You're a clever man, friend John. You reason well, and your wit is bold, but you are too prejudiced. You do not let your eyes see nor your ears hear, and that which is outside your daily life is not of account to you. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are, that some people see, things that others cannot? but there are things old and new which must be contemplated by men's eye, or must not be contemplated by men's eyes, because they know or think they know some things which other men have told them. Ah, it is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all if it explains not. And it says there is nothing to explain. And he goes on, Um, they talk about hypnotism. They talk about, do you believe in these charms? It's again re-emphasizing this point. I think if like there's any character who gets it, uh, is supposed to emphasize the main point Bram Stoker's getting apart is Van Helsing. He is standing in the gap of these worlds in this like perfect idealized way. But also he's like an old man and he's only going to be able to pass on his knowledge in a limited capacity. You do get the sense of he is like the last of some kind of dying breed. You know what I mean? Like these guys aren't going to be able to teach the things Van Helsing has properly taught them because like they know the rudimentary shit. Like, okay, garlic stops him, but it seems like Van Helsing's the only guy who gets why, and like the reader never will.
Well, and he doesn't
Yeah.
fall victim to like the sophistry, right? That, of course Seward is making a in-depth study of Renfield and his psychology, right? Renfield, our Dracula thrall. But like he does fall into like some really what really amounts to vibes, but dressed up in like medical-esque language. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. Uh I presume that the sanguine temperament itself and the disturbing influence end in a mentally accomplished finish. A possibly dangerous man, Renfield. Probably dangerous, if unselfish. In selfish men, caution is as secure an armor for their foes as for themselves. What I think of on this point is, when self is the fixed point, the centripetal force is balanced with the centrifugal. When duty, a cause, etc., is the fixed point, the latter force is paramount, and only accident or a series of accidents can balance it. And what he's basically saying is, okay, like if this guy gets a project, nothing can stop him, right? And like, is there really any like science to that? I don't think so. I'm not an expert in psychology, of course, but he's using a whole lot he's using a whole lot to say a very little here, is Seward.
I think Seward is very much like this character that's showing. I think it is showing a little bit the flaws of the like psychology system of the era. Like I think
Yeah.
intentionally, like I think Bram Stoker, like if you pressed him, would know, like, oh yeah, no, Seward's definitely running an imperfect shop over there
Mm.
at his asylum. Um, Not
Yeah.
the least of which he can basically know that one's talking to Dracula and be like, yeah, well, we'll get to him when we get to him. Um,
Yeah. Scoob, I think you had some thoughts on Seward?
I, yeah, it's like Bedlam House in the
Yeah.
film, and it's just maniacs running about, and they beat them down to subdue them.
Hmm.
And it's going back to the film, it's very effective in showing, Seward speaks kind of floridly, and he has this air of sophistication, but there's very little substance. And
Yes.
talking about this psychological world, then, you know, kind of painting over as Lucy's wasting away. They try to give her transfusions, blood transfusions. And Seward, Morris, Holmwood, all three of Lucy's suitors volunteer for these transfusions, and then Van Helsing himself does the last one
Hmm.
with no care for blood type or anything like that.
That crossed my mind, yeah.
if
So, how much
blood type doesn't matter if you just believe, Lenore.
close your eyes and wish, it'll be fine.
Maybe
But
so.
yeah, Seward kind of strikes me as sort of the nouveau rich. Like he's got a little bit of money. He had like the asylum is his.
Yeah.
He owns it. He operates it. He's the lead, but he kind of comes off as just a little boy. Like he
Hmm.
doesn't
Yeah.
know exactly what to do throughout every scene that he's in. He's like,
He also
oh,
seems to only care about this one patient, Van Helsing. Like he presumably has hundreds of patients, but he's like, there's just this one guy, and I see him when I see him. Um,
Slip him some spiders every now and then.
yeah, Renfield is his pet case.
yeah.
Like
Hmm.
And that goes back to like the childlike fixation. Like this is so weird.
Hmm.
Like these other guys are just run of the mill psychos. This is so weird.
I find there's like an interesting in this entire era of literature, fascination with the mind. Like they have this interest in like your disposition, your composition. Are you of strong will or are you of weak will? Do you have the fever of the brain? Do you have a melancholy? Do you have a like they're actually very hyper attentive about like what you've got going on between your ears in this, and they've got all kinds of explanations for why. But like it seems like in these like Victorian novels, this era of like book, like anyone is a bad day away from complete madness. Like you are the Joker at the drop of a hat in a Victorian novel. Like everybody is kind of, and it is interesting. Like there is this kind of like there is a, I mean, for lack of a better term, neuroses around neuroses almost. Like people are like, oh my God, like I could go like, what's going on between my ears? What's real? What's not? They're even dealing with what's the soul? What's all, this again, this fear of the old world and the new world colliding as technology develops, as capitalism develops, as they're running into the limits of what they can do. um,
Lovecraft, right? Genetically, what could be like lurking in my bloodline that could eventually drive me nuts?
yes, there's like great fear around that. Um, and of course they have different ways of expressing that. And they definitely women typically get the worst of it. Of course, like women could be like in this era lobotomized for having feelings. Like there was, if you look at like cases of like asylums for women in this era, like there was like people like actually going to the asylum because there were women who would like expressed interest in sex. Like it was a really harrowing time. Again, the Stoker comparison is not without merit. But it is interesting. This like so this character of the doctor in the asylum is this sort of respected profession, but then he's also a guy who doesn't seem to know what he's doing, and he just has to get told what to do by Van Helsing all the time. It's kind of interesting. He's straddling this middle ground here. And they're all kind of bordering on the edge of madness. So I do appreciate the like care it gives to the like weakness of the human brain. There is
Mhm.
something interesting to that as well.
Yeah, well, especially the circles that Stoker traveled in
Yeah.
and the he's writing about, you're expected to be mannered and proper.
Mm.
But like you were saying, so much is changing. Everything's going so fast. This is a time of rampant discovery. And well, what does it take? Like you said, everybody's one bad day away from just snapping and becoming brutish.
Hmm.
So I think that especially for the people Stoker would be writing for, that's a neurosis. That's
Yes.
a very real fear.
Yeah.
Like you said, a woman acts wrong and she's institutionalized.
Mm.
So I think that would be extremely relatable for his audience.
Yeah. And these men, they feel this sense of like they have to live up to a certain standard of being a certain way. And of course, everybody in between their ears knows they aren't the picture of the modern English man, like nobody is that. There is none that are like that. So it's interesting. Uh, it's this part of the novel where he really is like feeling himself. I feel like he's getting to write his long monologues of like really Stoker is just like cool shit. He gets to have Van Helsing go, like literally, literally Dr. John is trying to talk to him and he's like, silence. And it says he waved his hand for silence. Can you tell me why the tortoise lives more generations than me, and why the elephant goes on until he sees dynasties, and the parrot never die, only of the bite of the cat, or the dog of other complaint? Can you tell me why men believe in all ages and places there are men and women who cannot die? We all know, because science has vouched for the fact that there have been toads shut up in rocks for thousands of years. This goes on. I won't read, but like this is like, especially these Helsing monologues are places Stoker is having a lot of fun,
Mhm.
and playing with these themes the most of like science has showed us that we don't get it. You know what I mean? Like, and also like, and if you to extrapolate it to broader society, we have developed all of this stuff, all of this power, all of these resources, all of these materials. Um, and we still haven't solved our social ills as well, right? Like not just talking about like magic and religion. We have not solved the issue of poverty. We have not solved the issue of unhappiness. We have not solved these issues of mental illness. In fact, they're getting worse. People are still getting these horrible diseases and dying of them. These wars are still happening, and in fact, they're intensifying, right? This modernity is revealing so much, and then it is revealing how much they don't know. And that is actually a very scary place to be. And like Lenore said, in a lot of ways, this is like you can see how, less than a generation later, you end up having like Lovecraft and things like that, because this is very much in that same vein.
Well, and indeed, like they have this dichotomy between like the child brain of Dracula versus like the adult brain of like them here in the here and now, enlightened by science and whatnot, you know. And what the scary bit of it is that, well, Dracula's learning very quickly. You know, he has hundreds of years of culture and of history and of science to catch up on, but he's catching up. And that's part of the horror is being out moderned by this thing out of the East, out of the frontier, out of the past, right? And falling to this historically regressive force.
I was a big fan of when Van Helsing looked at the audience and said, "In this moment, I'm euphoric, not because of any phony Dracula's blessing, but because I am enlightened by my own intelligence." If you get it, you get it. I don't
Hips his little Dutch fedora.
know. I'm not a professional quote maker, just one for the heads. Well, Jonathan Harker gets back and he's like, "Yo, I'm back. I saw Dracula." And Mina's like, "Yo, that sucks. Let's get married." And they get married. I'm summarizing things very quickly. This book has long stretches that, like, I think for a modern audience can get a little tedious. I think there are moments in this where it's like, all right, like we know what's coming. You're holding off and holding off and holding off. I think Stoker would say, "Yeah, I'm doing that on purpose." 'Twas the style at the time. I do like sometimes when I already see what's coming and it's forecasted it endlessly, not to have to wait. But I understand what he's doing with it, and it's fully a matter of taste.
Hmm.
But this crew will eventually all link up because, of course, Mina is sad about Lucy's death, and the others want revenge. They realize that she got turned into a vampire, and Velden Helsing is able to bring them together, share the knowledge he has, and he's like, "All right, we're gonna hunt down Dracula." And this is where we get into like Dracula's plan, which is much more is like pretty sophisticated, is realizing that he must return to the dirt in which he was buried in, or some kind of cursed dirt of his homeland. He has sent 40 boxes and placed them in different properties around the city so he can sleep in different layers. And I found that interesting. Like obviously in a movie, you might don't have as much time, but like in the new Nosferatu movie, for instance, they're like, "We gotta burn his lair." And it's like in the book, he's got 40 boxes. Though I do appreciate that you could just drop a communion wafer in one of them and then it's cooked. That's pretty funny to me. What I was going to
It's like,
ask y'all, and I wanted to hear from both of y'all on this. If you're Dracula, what plot do you, given Dracula's limitations, what plot do you pursue in London to have your victory here? What strategies should Dracula have followed here?
see, I'm worried that Dracula didn't really think it through. There
Mm,
does seem to be much of an end game for him as such, or a game plan rather. I mean, I guess the end game is conquest, but there's a scene where, you know, gender roles are kind of inverted.
hmm
Mina drinks from Dracula.
Hmm.
hmm
It describes her as, clutched to his breast, almost like a
Yeah.
mother, and she's drinking from a wound that he cut in himself. But yet it kind of goes back to the three, Van Helsing calls them the Weird Sisters,
hmm
Rise of Dracula. Like, why were there only three other vampires in this place that he had reigned over for hundreds of years?
Hmm.
So, we see with Lucy that vampirism isn't a sudden turn. It takes a while.
hmm It does
So,
note that the vampires are patient. That's also a factor of them because he's like, why wouldn't you be?
right. And maybe that's colored his plan to where he's like, no, I can do the long game. And he didn't take, and I guess because of his feelings of superiority, when he goes back to the blood of the Huns runs through my veins and thus and such, he's like, I can defeat anything that comes to me. So maybe his plan was 150 years long and it just gets extremely curtailed. But
Maybe we're still living in his plan. Maybe this was part of the plan all along. Who knows?
His
maybe
plan.
a great book by an English author named, actually, it's a series, an English author named Kim Philby called Anno Dracula,
Ooh.
where
What's that about?
Dracula's plan is completed. It's a speculative alternate fiction.
Ooh.
Dracula eventually marries Queen Victoria. She's restored to youth. She becomes a vampire. And vampirism kind of, no, I'm sorry. I think I said Kim Philby. It's Kim Newman. Kim
Ken
Philby
Newman.
was, yeah, Kim Philby was a British spy. I'm sorry. Uh, but yeah, Dracula becomes like the prince consort of the British Empire.
That's fascinating. Wow. I just wrote that down. I'm gonna have to follow up on that. But yeah, maybe that's Dracula's plot. Lenore, what tactics do you think Dracula should have followed here?
Just burn down the customs house that his shit like went through and was recorded in. Like without that's the thing. Like Stoker loves his procedures,
He
right?
does. He
Stoker
does.
loves tracking down the stevedores that moved all this shit, the timetables of the ships that carried the Dracula's Earth to Britain, right? And tracking down all the bookkeeping, all the records, and seeing, okay, it went to this address, and to that address, and to that address. Like literally, if Dracula had just burned down the whatever customs house had all that shit, they would have been stopped dead in their tracks.
Well, you can tell like Stoker's influence just as a manager. Like his main job is managing a theater. And what's
Yes.
interesting is he had to do the business managing, but he also had to do stage managing a lot of the time. So he is like doing a lot. Like he is a having to be a details guy. So yeah, I think he has that appreciation of detail. One thing I was gonna say is it would be sick if Dracula, like, I don't know, put his box in a place no one could get except him. I think that would be
Mm.
smart. Maybe he was going to do that. But if you bury the box really deep and you got like a little hole, something like that, could be kind of cool.
And there he is, yeah.
But he doesn't have time to do that. They hunt down all the Dracula boxes, which sounds like something you got to find in a Castlevania game. Hunt down all the Dracula boxes. But they do. And there's a moment that's very funny to me where there's a bunch of rats that get summoned and they bring a terrier and they have to like pick it up and like wave it at the rats and they run. It's kind of an amusing image to me of the terrier not really wanting to be part of this. Uh and being freaked out, but the rats also being freaked out. But they're like feeling out the edges of Dracula's abilities here, like his control over animals, his control over
Mm.
weather. Um, and it's interesting because it notes Dracula is also kind of doing testing, like trying, failing, moving on, like someone feeling a wall for infirmities, and then when something works, he moves forward. And they, in many ways, are also doing that. It's trial and error which of these techniques and stuff will work. Um,
Dracula crosses the river by feeling for the stones.
yes, and at high tide or at sunset or whatever the specifics are.
Mhm.
Um, And so that is like an interesting thing as well. Scoob identified it earlier, but the vampire hunters very much are like mirroring Dracula's tactics.
Mhm.
And eventually, when Mina, as we said, gets bit and then forced to drink the blood of Dracula, um, they are even need to rely on the fact that Mina has this sort of vampirism thing going on to get her to oh my God, what's the word? Hypnotize her and to see where Dracula's at. So as we speed towards this ending here, after Lucy, or I'm sorry, after Mina gets bit, you have Van Helsing, who has, been obsessive and strange, he ends up in a situation where he, for a second there, he's talking about Dracula as if he's a deity. In fact, he compares himself to Enoch from the Bible. He says, "Because I walk with God." Um, and then in a moment of defiance, he kind of defies, pushes back against Dracula, and they find his like neck broken. He's just smashed on the ground, and he's able to kind of give him some last information on Dracula's actions. Um, justice for Renfield. He went through too much shit.
Hmm.
Um, Renfield went through it. I haven't seen the Nicolas Cage movie with Renfield yet, but I've been intending to. But maybe we get justice for Renfield in that movie. I don't know. He went through a time. But I found that I found that like I've read this passage, like Renfield having this sort of heroism when he grapples with Dracula. It says and Renfield's talking. As I knew I was a madman, at times anyhow, I resolved to use my power, which is, I think, funny. And he felt it too, for he had come out of the mist to struggle with me. I held tight and I thought I was going to win, for I didn't mean him to take any more of her life till I saw his eyes. They burned into me, and my strength became like water. He slipped through it, and when I tried to cling to him, he raised me up and flung me down. There was a red cloud before me, and a noise like thunder, and the mist seemed to steal away under the door. Um, I thought some of the language here was like felt very like, it's a little later, but like Tolkien-esque as well. Like some of the description of the eyes and the struggling and like some of that felt like that, as well as this kind of character, this like kind of redemption arc of this character. Um, I found that to be interesting, and I found, yeah, Renfield gets to be a sort of reverse Gollum. He actually gets to have his like happy ending. Um, Now, this book, in this book, if you're tainted by a vampire, most of the time you're probably going to hell. I don't know if Renfield's going to heaven or not, but he
Yeah.
got to have his moment.
Well, and especially like if you're tainted by a vampire, right, as he is, like he's got this weird obsession with like consuming as many lives as possible, right? And not just like outright, but like in like he'll feed flies to spiders and then he'll feed those spiders to like a bird, right? And then he wants a cat.
Lenore,
Um
have you never XP grinded in a video game before? That's just
I
what that
mean,
is.
man, I when I sit down and I play like Cookie Clicker or whatever, like
That's
you
what
know,
Renfield was doing.
I
Yeah.
understand the impulse, right? I understand him like getting like other spiders to grab flies for him, and then like every so often he gets a score multiplier for the fucking lives or whatever. But like it's a weird obsession that he gets stuck with. And that seems to be the fate of like everybody who gets tainted by Dracula in some way. Although like Mina's obsession toward the end is put to good use, right? Because she's into like trains, right? So she figures, okay, like this is the most efficient way to get to like Castle Dracula and whatnot. There's that, sure. Um, but it seems to me that like if you're a thrall of a vampire, right, you're a slave to these compulsions. And indeed one of the it's not in this book, but one of the attributes of being a vampire is this obsession with counting, right? If you scatter had you not heard this?
I'm just thinking about Sesame Street.
Oh yeah, no, well, that's literally what it comes from. Like, one way to defend yourself against a vampire, right, is just like scatter some rice or whatever, and then a vampire has to stop and like count every grain of rice before they continue on, right?
One, two, and
Yeah,
so
the,
on.
the laughing really does slow him down. Yeah,
Mhm.
so like that's the thing, right? It's the ability of it's the ability to really correlate all the information that is suddenly available to you, right? You're overwhelmed by like super hearing, super sight, like you're in tune with the world as a vampire in a way that like humans are not, and if you can master that sense, that's what makes you dangerous.
But then humans can win if they're like just rules lawyers, basically. Like Van
Pretty
Helsing,
much.
who is just like, no, 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 no. I've studied the handbook, and it says the rose and the garlic and the water and the vampires actually have a shit ton of weaknesses in this book. Typically, I feel like vampire lore or vampire stories, they pick like a couple of these, like this one's real and this one's real and then or whatever. And this one, it's like not all of them.
Hmm.
all of this shit applies.
Except sunlight, like the big one.
Except sunlight. And now he's definitely less powerful in the daytime and like stuff, but like, and he's got to like return to his, his soil sometimes. But
The soil, which like is specifically the hallowed soil that his ancestors are interred in, which again, there's another sense of like this good and holy thing that can be corrupted, right?
yes, no doubt. So we race on towards the end here. Dracula realizes he's been beat, and like he did in ancient days in his ancient wars, his thought process is, I'll go back, I'll outweight them, and I'll come back. I'll strike again. So they got to pursue him. And they do a really bad job of it. Like they like know pretty much like he can come to a couple ports, and they're like they get there like 2 weeks ahead of time, and then like when he lands, they're like, "Ah, you just missed him." It's like, damn it, guys, you've been here for 2 weeks. I found that to be funny. I also found it to be funny that it's so much quicker to go over land. I don't quite understand the appeal of going over sea if you can get over land so quickly. Um, but I would be afraid as Dracula that the boat would go down, TBH.
I mean, I guess there's just like I mean, I think it's for that reason that they don't go over CA, but also like, there's so many ways that they can like speed their passage along. There's lots of bribes in this book, right, that are
Hmm.
very obliquely referred to as yeah, and I made the proper contribution, here and there, right? Mina herself literally says, what a joy, what a pleasure, there's such power in money, right? Like
Yeah, let me read that quote actually, because I made this note because I thought it was useful.
Yeah, did this stand out to you, Scoob, that like so much of the contours of their struggle come from the fact that like they're doing they're doing stuff that they can afford to, right? They come from money, right? And so
Yeah.
they can track all this down, they can bribe all these people. Like it's interesting to me, and I'm curious if you thought about like what a different book this would be if they had just been like, regular
Working class.
people. Yeah.
Well, Mina kind, what you were just talking about. Mina kind of lampshades that a little bit.
Hmm.
She's
Yeah, the
at,
quote is specifically, and I want to hear the end of your thought just so that people can hear it. Mina says, "Oh, it did me good to see the ways these brave men worked. How can women help loving men when they are so earnest and so true and so brave? And two, it made me think of the wonderful power of money. What can it not do when basely used? I felt so thankful that Lord Godalming is rich, and both he and Mr. Morris, who also has plenty of money, are willing to spend it so freely. For if they did not, our little expedition could not start." Anyway, I just wanted to give that context for what you were talking about, Scoob.
yeah, Mina and Jonathan, lower middle class
Yeah, but
virgin.
then they inherit the money, but yeah.
She's like, holy shit, having money rules
Yeah.
Hmm.
because
That's
it
true.
just greases everything. It facilitates them getting there so much earlier. She's like
Hmm.
a whole different world.
And it's notable in his escape. Dracula, even when he is facing mortal peril, takes time to grab some money on his way because he needs it. He needs it to pay for his passage, right? Like this is the rules of even this like ancient being has had to learn the rules of the modern world, which is completely greased by gold.
Has taken great
Um,
care indeed to study the legal landscape of Britain, and the names of the people working in law there.
Earlier at the beginning of the book, when Harker just gets to Castle Dracula, Dracula is asking, so I can have one lawyer to take care of my real estate. I can have one lawyer to take care of any investments.
Hmm.
So that's where the other properties come from that they didn't know about. They knew about Carfax Abbey, but
mhm.
then the property where all these other boxes of dirt you were talking about, they had no idea. They had to stumble upon that.
And I think there is like definitely this fear in this book of like, what if this other masters our systems and they do it better than us, you know? And I find that, that's part of the fear. No, part of it is that clash with the old world and the new, but part of it is what if people outside our system that now are coming into contact with it indeed master, perfect, and turn the system around on us, which I find to be a regular. I mean, that's also the regular fear of the colonized or colonizer, right? Is, well, what if what I did to you happens to me? The
Mm.
British, and I think Stoker would be well aware of this because as an Irish person, they heard that all the time. Well, if we let the Irish, if we let Irish have self-governance, they're going to do to us what we did to them. That was a common refrain in this period. Things like that. So I think there is like some of that too. It's like, oh God, the Eastern European is mastered capitalism. Well, how horrifying. And it's like, well, he saw the rules and he's playing by them. At least
Mm.
at least he comes by being a bloodsucker, honestly, unlike, probably the lawyers that Jonathan's working with. Um, but you at this point, it races towards the climax. You have the four men chasing behind Dracula's boat, which it is kind of funny, like how helpless Dracula kind of is in his last passages here, because he's really got to get back to his home. He's stuck in his box for long periods of time, and the boat's kind of chugging along. Meanwhile, and he's got his hired guards around him. Meanwhile, Van Helsing and Mina go to Dracula's castle again. It's very fearsome and scary to take down the three women, and to await Dracula so they can all kind of encircle him with their net. Because here's the thing, even if he doesn't come back for another generation, if Mina dies with the mark on her, she is still going to like become a vampire. At the very least, her soul is tainted. It seems like the rules, at least as they understand them, are that like, because Lucy, it shows pretty clearly still goes to heaven, but like the rules, it seems, are like the sins you commit as a
Well,
vampire, even if compelled upon you, will still count. It's that part's a little unclear to me.
Lucy goes to heaven specifically because she is sent there, right? Like
Sure.
because they destroy her. I'll flip back to her death bit here. Uh
But that is what Mina wants to make sure happens. She wants her soul to be safe as well, not
right,
just her
exactly.
body.
Because if Dracula outweights them all, right, and they all die, they can't, there can't be that hand that strikes the fateful blow. Yeah. When Van Helsing's talking about Lucy. But of the most blessed of all, when this now undead be made to rest as true dead, then the soul of the poor lady whom we love shall again be free. Instead of working wickedness by night and growing more debased in the assimilation of it by day, she shall take her place with the other angels. So that, my friend, it will be a blessed hand for her that shall strike the blow that sets her free, right? And he's gassing up her husband to do this. Yeah,
I think it's interesting talking about like the sin she commits will debase her soul. It's like, so do sins committed as a vampire count against your immortal soul? I know it doesn't matter that much, but one can't help it. That feels like an unfair rule.
A little bit, and it's it's very odd when you just juxtapose it with Lucy.
Mhm.
Hmm.
She kidnapped orphans as the Blue Fur Lady, but she's absolved of those as soon as
Yeah. Maybe because
like
she didn't kill anybody.
perhaps, yeah, yeah, okay, sure, sure, sure.
Maybe it's like a mortal sin type situation. I don't know.
Well, because you can inflict a lot of pain on somebody without killing them.
That's true.
Yeah,
And you still shouldn't be, kidnapping children. Still not good behavior, even if yeah, out of context, that sounds terrible. Me being like, well, she didn't kill. The socialist shelf does not endorse kidnapping children, no matter what your intention is. I'll also say that it is notable. Well, actually, I'll hold off. But Dracula does even experience a type of relief though when his life ends. So who knows?
It's that thing of right. It's interesting that we read this so soon after every young man's battle, right? Like there is a specific way that you can get right with God if you adopt this bearing and if you repent in your heart and your soul, right? Perhaps if you have an accountability buddy like ready to stake you through the heart, right? Like there's somebody, particularly a woman in Lucy's case, right, falls to a seduction out of this less enlightened like land, history, whatever, and she can only be saved if she is destroyed by brave men in her life, right? There's this act of charity that can restore her beauty, not what the text is saying is this like unnatural beauty of somebody who should be a corpse, right? But like, you know, the actual like I mean it says right here after she's after she's died. Yeah, Lucy, as we'd seen her in life with her face of unequaled sweetness and purity, right? And it's at that point that her husband has the right to kiss her. Because when she's a vampire already and she's like, and she wants to kiss him, like Van Helsing stops because he's like, no, like she's gonna get you. But now
Mhm.
that but now that she's been, pulled back from the brink, that's when, her husband has the right to her again.
Mhm.
It's very, very odd politically.
Well, you get very close to Mina falling into the clutches of the vampires, not just for the magic on her, but then when they go to Castle Dracula, the three vampire women, call them the Weird Sisters, or what have you, they are like tempting her. Van Helsing has to make a communion wafer force field, basically, which is kind of funny. Imagining that like a circle around the camp, but you have like a really metal scene of where he's saying, "Don't go," and he looks her in the eyes and says, "Is it for? It's for you, I fear." And Mina laughs, a low laugh and unreal, and said, "Fear for me? Why fear for me? None safer in all the world from them than I am." And as I wondered at the meaning of her words, a puff of wind made the flame leap up, and I see the red scar on her forehead. Then, alas, I knew. Did I not? I would soon have learned, for the wheeling figures of mist and snow came closer, but keeping ever without the holy circle. Then they began to materialize till if God have not taken away my reason, for I saw through my own eyes, there were before me in the actual flesh the three same women that Jonathan saw in the room when they would have kissed his throat. I knew the swaying round forms, the bright hard eyes, the white teeth, the ruddy color, the voluptuous lips. They smiled even at poor dear Madam Mina, and their laugh came through the silence of the night. They twined their arms and pointed to her and said in those so sweet tingling tones that Jonathan said were of the intolerable sweetness of the water glasses, "Come, sister, come to us, come." And then they fucking kill the horses. Um, so like you have like some really metal moments like this, and Van Helsing having to go up to the castle and just personally kill the sisters while they sleep in their coffins in a really like gnarly scene,
God
you know?
forbid women have hobbies.
That's what I'm saying. They look, they were still trying to have fun. Dracula, think about it. When they're at the castle, Dracula's always saying, "No, no, you can't drink the blood. No, no, this one's for me." I bet he says that about everybody, right? Finally, they get their own prey. Van Helsing has to mess it up. Justice for the weird sisters, the vampire bitches, whatever you want to call them. Justice for those three. Justice for the trio. This is Lenore's I can fix them corner, I assume. But
I can fix them. I can become them. Like I just want more of these characters.
I wonder if any of you have seen the Brides of Dracula Christopher Lee movie.
No,
I haven't either. I wonder if that's what that's about. I wonder if it's about them. 'Cause Christopher Lee made like 8 of those Dracula movies. There were a shit
Oh
ton of them.
yeah, yeah. No, like Hammer Horror had so much of had so he was in the Hammer stuff. There was other stuff that he played Dracula in. Like I'm thinking of that one West German film, The Torture Chamber of Dr. Sadism. Like a billion others. Like that was his thing.
Yeah, he was original, and Peter Cushing was in like half of those as Dr. Van Helsing,
That's right.
no.
starting in what, like the late 50s, something like that.
Going back to what you were talking about with, Dracula living with three vampiric women, the brides of Dracula.
Mhm.
I think that kind of goes back to the actual Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah.
Um, you know, he was a hostage to the Ottoman Empire in his younger days.
Mm.
Mhm.
And so I guess that's supposed to recall like the Ottoman harem, maybe.
Oh,
It
could
could.
be.
There's a lot of references being thrown around, and we still don't have the entirety of Stoker's notes and stuff. One thing that's interesting too, like, is that a lot of things he has in this are things that like aren't fully understood Eastern European folklore. He like thought he picked up on something and it wasn't. So it also could just be that, like there were inferences of inferences. There are words that sound like other words, that kind of thing. So I think that well could be if that's like, especially at that time, that was a thing that fascinated, the British about. the Ottomans. That was like a if you see like, you know, media that they made that was like set in that, they would always focus on the harem aspect. They would always come back to that, you know. That was like a so I think you're barking up an interesting tree there. It's impossible to say whether it's right or not because, you know, unless somebody's turning Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker's Dracula is Bram Stoker as a Dracula. I don't know. It's not anything. They close in on Dracula himself. The final confrontation, you know, he's waiting for sunset. It's getting dangerous. He's got his like army of hired men who are taking him back to the castle where he'll be essentially invincible. The sun is setting and they're like, the men are rushing. Van Helsing's got the gun out. There's wolves. Shit's getting crazy. Um, and then, yeah, they flip that thing over. Yeah, you get to this. I'll read this. The sun was almost down on the mountaintops, and the shadows of the whole group fell upon the snow. I saw the Count lying within the box upon the earth, some of which the rude falling from the cart had scattered over him. He was deathly pale, just like a waxen image, after the red eyes glared out with the horrible vindictive look which I knew so well. As I looked, the eyes saw the sinking sun, and the look of hate in them turned to triumph. But on the instant came the sweep and flash of Jonathan's great knife. I shrieked as I saw it shear through the throat, whilst at the same moment Mr. Morris's bowie knife plunged into the heart. It was like a miracle, but before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight. I shall be glad, as long as I live, that even in that moment of final dissolution, there was in the face a look of peace, such as I never could have imagined might have rested there. The castle of Dracula now stood against the red sky, and every stone of its broken battlements was articulated against the light of the setting sun. So it goes pretty hard. And in that fight, Mr. Morris unfortunately picked up a knife wound and has to be the obligatory other character that dies. Somebody's got to die in the final fight. It's just the rules. R.I.P. Quincy. You rep Texas well. What do y'all think of that? What do y'all think of Dracula having that relief at the end there?
I mean, it's there's a lot of Christianity in this book, right? And I guess it's this idea that yeah, you know, even the even this embodiment of evil that's drawn out of something good and that parasitically like exists off of it can be redeemed, right? Like in a way, it would be, I suppose, and I don't, and you know, I'm no expert in on the theology here, but I suppose that like even God himself can indeed still save this soul, right? There's nothing that's truly beyond heaven in the estimation of this book. But if that's the case, then why is there a hell, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dracula didn't repent.
Mm,
You know, he was killed.
right.
So, but it goes back to the theme of corruption and corruption being beaten back,
Hmm.
you know, virtue being restored.
And sacrifice, right? Being necessary in that. Quincy having to die and everyone having to go through a serious amount of pain and everyone being willing to die and give their lives, you know? They spend a whole lot of time in this book being like, y'all promise you'll kill me, right? You'll promise you'll kill me if I need to. You know, they pretty much all have to make that agreement to each other, like understandably so. Nobody's trying to be a Dracula. Um, but like it is, yeah, no, it all tracks together and it ends really, it really ends on this like the last sentence of the final chapter, which doesn't count the epilogue, is you know, Quincy says, I'm only too happy to have been of service. Oh God, it was worth for this to die. Look, look. They say amen. The dying man spoke. Now God be thanked that all has not been in vain. See, the snow is not more stainless than her forehead. The curse is passed away. And to our bitter grief, and with a smile and in silence, he died, a gallant gentleman. And then it's just the end note, which is just like, you know, saying that it's 7 years have passed. Dracula's dead. We we named our kid Quincy, and then you have the very last bit of the book being the very last thing being a quote from Van Helsing while bouncing young Quincy on his knee, saying, because they said, we have no way of proving any of this. And he says, we want no proofs. We ask none to believe us. This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on, he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare much for her sake. And that's the end. And it's interesting. It's not a hyperclimactic end. It really like they kill Dracula and it doesn't, dun dun dun, maybe there's more It doesn't do any of that. It's like it allows the narrative to end and Van Helsing to be like, yeah, we're gonna tell the story of how people made this sacrifice. Um and I wonder, it's a really saccharine, very sweet ending to a narrative that has been plagued by a lot of darkness. What are y'all's thoughts on that? And also like kind of how quickly it just happens and wraps up. What do y'all think?
But yeah, it was essentially one crazy summer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's probably some trauma related to it. So they're like, yeah, we're just not going to talk about it. And I think the saccharine plays, I think the epilogue really helps with the verisimilitude of the story because you said earlier there's long passages, long stretches where not much actually happens. It's day to day, and this is another part of that slice of life where it's like you know we've been through the journey. It's 7 years later. I think 7 years in particular was maybe a marked choice
Yeah.
of as far as God's perfect number. Order has been restored. We don't have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Go back to life.
I also think it's, and they say, we don't have to talk about it. We'll commemorate it. We'll let the kid know that a lot of work was done. But, I guess when your option for when you're dealing with trauma is to go to Dr. Seward, you probably will just deal with it yourself. Huh?
Thank you.
Wait,
I'll
say that
support.
again.
I said, I'm good. Thank you. I'll support your work from afar. But
It's like, well, he's got such results with Renfield. I mean,
um, there's a Mel Brooks comedy, Dracula Dead and Loving It.
not seen it.
Have you?
I have not.
It's Leslie Nielsen is Dracula.
Okay. See, I'm getting like a list of stuff I got to check out. There's just so much, there's so many branches of media that come off of this, stories that this has motivated people to feel about.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Seward in Dracula Dead and Loving It is obsessed with giving people enemas.
I can see that.
Yeah, it's like it's his bloodletting. He's like, yeah, I'll
Hmm.
give you and it's right. You'll be right as rain.
It's the only
No problem.
way. Fix all the
So
problems.
That
it was
yeah, the fascination that this book has with medical procedures like transfusions, like pseudo scientific stuff like hypnosis, no, like that, like the enema thing, it does come out of a very specific sort of is the punchline to a very specific and pre-existing setup, to be sure.
mhm.
Um, but Jacob, you're absolutely right though that like this story has been adapted endlessly. Its influence on horror and on media in general has been titanic, right? And it's the through line that runs through, not all the adaptations, but quite a lot of them is there is such a thing as in the context of this story, there is such a thing as objective good, even in a modern enlightened age that has moved beyond, stories of monolithic good, monolithic evil, right? You know, all the saints' lives are in the past. You know, I wonder if Bram Stoker is not writing this at his own end of history, right? Where the system of treaties governing Europe prevails, where all the land has been divided up, where there is, Irishman that he was, he did hail from preeminent empire at the time, right? And in a world that whose, of course, we were only 20 years out from, a horrific inter-imperialist war, but at the time, right, there was, the clouds had not broken yet,
Yeah.
the great struggles seems to have been in the past. And so there is this idea, I think, running through this, that yeah, there is still some objective good worth fighting for, and people do still have it in them to fight for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's again, not no real class analysis here, but for the type of person writing and reading this, it hits.
I think there is some analysis you could make because at this time, Queen Victoria was still Queen of England. She was
Mm-hmm.
called Mother of Europe because so many, you know, the King of Luxembourg was her son.
Mm.
Germany didn't exist as we know it. It was a bunch of small city states, but many of its rulers were her progeny. So it was a time of still the empire, but also more more unification.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as you said, all of the struggles were behind them. So they thought. And then World War One happens and calamity. But I think viewing it from a lens of, well, what what bad could happen except for something outside
Something
coming in
out,
and
yeah, something
And
outside, and yet, also born of again, it's the hallowed soil that Dracula can move around in, which quite surprises me, right? Because it was the soil that his ancestors were buried in. It's something bubbling beneath the surface that we in our hubris didn't see coming.
it's
exact
yeah, it's something outside and not something outside that will crush us with overwhelming strength because they're not worried about Dracula bringing an army, across the English Channel. It's something subversive and it's a poison that can slip in that we won't understand, you know, uh, and they have that deep fear because something is wrong and what something must be because our systems work so well, right? All the in theory, all the systems work so well in this book, right? Every time they need the papers and the transfers and the telegraphs, and it all works great. The mail service in this book is fucking killing it.
yeah,
They're delivering letters like no problem. The trains are running like no problem, right? The system, it is a fear of that collapse. And I think that obviously this thing's legacy has a lot to do with just how well constructed it is, how compelling it is, but I think it's also because it sits at this spoke in history where all these different or this central point in history where all these spokes come off of, where all these directions, where all of this history explodes out of as the 21st century starts. It's like we can imagine Dracula in so many places because Dracula was able to be here at this like starting gun or just before the starting gun. And in a way that like now Dracula is with us always going forward because that the Dracula poison got in just before everything exploded. I don't know.
One must
There's something
imagine
to it.
Dracula happy.
But there is, I mean, it's I was reading, the West Wendy Doniger, the writer on folklore, literally said all she called it vampire literature centerpiece. She says all vampires are BS or AS before Stoker or after Stoker. This is fun. It is the fundamental shaper of it, which I think would have blown Stoker away before he wrote it. And I think it would have blown him away up till the day he died. But it it will certainly continue to make big waves on all of us. Well, before we get into our end here, do either of y'all have any final thoughts on this novel or final things you want to bring up here?
again, I read it initially when I was super young, and I was like, yeah, yeah, I got it, and I kind of just let it pass, and because, as you said, there's so much. Dracula has more media written, filmed about him than any other character in history.
Hmm.
So there's so much lore that, you know, the original, the text kind of falls by the wayside. And so to come back to it 3 decades later, it was, and to be able to see it from a more adult stance, actually get the subtext. It's no wonder it's such an important book.
Yeah, 100%. For all its flaws, it hits. For all its flaws, it hits.
Stoker had a lot to say, and Renfield was a self-insert, or I'm sorry, not Renfield, but Van Helsing was a self-insert character.
Yeah.
And, you said earlier, Stoker kind of kept his politics to himself for one reason or the other. And I think Van Helsing, he just let himself go.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think he likes to dream of getting to be that one day, the old guy that doesn't give a fuck anymore and he can just be, which
Well,
he didn't live to that old.
I want to be one of Dracula's brides when I grow up, except cut out Dracula and just like have the four of us chilling in the castle.
You want to be the bride of the bride.
Mm.
Bride of Lenore. Does that sound as good as Bride of Dracula? I don't know, but we can make it work. Bride
It's
of
got-
Bride. We'll work on it. We'll workshop it. Well, while we workshop that in the meantime, Scoob, thank you for coming on. Thank you for volunteering to do this, for talking to, the listeners don't know, but it is quite late at night as well, here on the Eastern Seaboard. So we
My fault.
appreciate you. Lenore, it's because you're working, proletarian grind, but Scoob, is there anything that you'd like to, I know, you don't have a show or anything, but is there anything you'd like to plug, encourage people, anything like that? Anything you want to give folks at the end here?
Watch Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Like, I hadn't seen it in a couple years, and I rewatched it this week just to kind of refamiliarize myself. And good gravy, it's a masterpiece. It's the last really good thing Coppola's done, in my opinion.
I was about to say, shocking that the same man made Megalopolis.
Well, he followed this up with the Robin Williams flick Jack,
Oh God.
completely different. But yeah, I really enjoyed reading the book. Like I said, hadn't done it in a very long time. I knew it. Turns out I didn't know it. There's a lot to this book.
That's how it goes. Yep. Well, we appreciate everyone. Lenore, do we know what we're reading for the next one? We've been meaning to announce them at the end of the episodes, but actually I don't know. What are we reading next?
Oh, Liberation Day, George Saunders.
Liberation Day, George Saunders. If you want to read along, folks, get that in. We're gonna have a couple cool guests for that one.
I was
So
just telling Jacob earlier today, like I've read a couple of the stories thus far. They make my blood boil. That's a good thing, and you'll see why.
absolutely. Well, to close us out, I just want to say, no, actually, I don't have what I have. Lenore, do you have any final thoughts to give us?
The Brides of Dracula could fix me.
I think they'd ruin you, but I don't think I convince you to stop.
That's what I mean.
Y'all have a good one.
Peace out.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.